Well, it's actually a sunny day back here in Ohio. I have the feeling that if we were back in Ohio, you might be asking to have today's class outside. So, hopefully wherever you guys are, the weather is nice as well. I'm going to say a few words about Chapter 15. This will be the only lecture I'm going to have on Chapter 15 on wage inequality. It's a relatively short chapter. It's about 20 pages, but you'll see a lot of that is just tables with numbers, and to read it won't take you that long. Always remember when you're looking at all these tables, what is the point each table is trying to make? Don't memorize the numbers. What's the key point? So I just thought what I could contribute today is updating some of the numbers that you see in Chapter 15 and just kind of taking it up to the most recent data I could find, which was 2018. The 2019 data hasn't yet been compiled. Actually, the source of the data is the current population survey, the one we've been using in the SHAD assignments. So what we have here is actual data on wage inequality. Now, the book talks about earnings. Earnings are just the amount that you would get in your paycheck. This talks about wages, and this is how much you would receive for an hour of work. The results are going to be the same, just a very slight difference, and this data will take us up to the minute. So what we've done here is we've divided people up by the percentile. So in other words, if you're in the 90th percentile, you earn more than 90% of the population and less than about 10%. So what we can see is in 2000, 2007, 2017, and 2018, we can see at the different percentiles how much people are earning. So one of the things that I want to kind of walk you through something to see how we can demonstrate what's been happening with wage inequality. Let's say we look at three, I would argue, rather important percentiles. We'll look at people in the 10th percentile. So the most recent data, they earned almost $10 an hour. Those people at the median, those people that should have been 1880, my mistake, I made a mistake transposing. People at the 50th percentile were earning $18.80. There's roughly 2,000 hours in a work year, roughly 50 weeks a year times 40 hours a week. The result is people work about 2,000 hours. You can do the math. So somebody making $18.80 an hour would be making about $39,000 a year. And at the 95th percentile, people are making $63.10. That's roughly $125,000 a year, not an hour. So what we can do is we can make comparisons. This is what we see in the chart. Just wanted to walk you through it. We can compare people at the middle to the bottom. People at the 50th percentile compared to the 10th. 1890 should have been 1880 divided by 997. That's 1.89. And we can compare the top to the middle, those at the 95th to the 50th. What this is telling us here, people at the 95th percentile, those that make more than 19 out of 20 people, make about 3.36 times as much as those at the median. And we compare those at the top to those at the bottom. Now, these ratios of people at different percentiles, they will tell us what's happened since the year 2000. So, what can we make out of this? Well, you can see that there has been relatively, we can look at this, this is the 1.89. It's just the ratio of those at the middle compared to, those at the bottom 10%. And we can look at those at the top compared to the middle, and we can look at those at the top compared to the bottom. The key here is, what's the story that the numbers tell you? Okay, here are the key points. If we look at those in the middle relative to those in the bottom 10%, there's been very little change. It used to be almost, the people in the middle made twice as much as those at the bottom. Now it's 1.9. I would argue that's very little change. By the way, you'll also notice in this 18-year period, every group saw an increase in their wages. This is corrected for inflation. First key point, Little change in the bottom relative, in the middle compared to the bottom. But what we see here is those at the top have been pulling away from those at the middle. It used to be about 2.9 times as much that they made. Now it's almost 3.4. If we compare those at the very top to those at the very bottom, whereas it used to be 5.65, now it's 6.33. These are the takeaways. Little change in the middle compared to the bottom, but the key here is those at the very top are pulling away from those at the middle and the bottom. And this is the data, this is the evidence correcting for inflation where we can see that. So we see that the wage rate grew for all groups between 2000 and 2018, but this is annual. People at the top, those were making about 1.2% more in real terms each year. Those at the very bottom, only about 0.6%. So when we look at this, everybody's been growing, but the biggest jumps have been for those at the top. And that's why we see an increase in wage inequality. It's not that the bottom has been falling, but the top has been growing faster. Now, suppose we look at it for the two genders. If we look at men, this is just men, what we see here is there's been growth for every group between 2000 and 2018. This is annual percent. By the way, you notice those at the bottom didn't have a really good year between 17 and 18. Okay, the 10th through the 70th percentile, the bottom, 70%, their growth was on the order of 0 to 0.2%. But those in the top groups, their growth was much larger, 0.6 to 2.0. You don't have to memorize the numbers. Here's the story. For men, growth was much greater for those in the top 20 or 30% compared to those in the bottom 70%. Everybody grew, but those at the top were pulling away. For women, everybody grew, but what we see is those at the bottom, they grew more than men, but the growth of women in the top 20% was not as great, especially for the very top group, as it was for men. So lower paid women in the bottom 70%, they were catching up to men, but higher paid men were pulling away from higher paid women. So what are the key points? What is it that I want you to take away from these numbers? There's been increasing inequality in wages since the year 2000. The college wage premium, in other words, how much you make because you went to college, is growing. Now remember, only about 30% of the workforce has a BA or more. So that's why you see growth at the very top. Those people with an education are growing. That's good news for you folks. But for those that lack a college degree, like the people we read about in Cut Loose, those are the ones that are struggling, and they're finding themselves falling farther behind other people. This is just wages. If they don't get health care and other fringe benefits, then they have to pay for that out of their wages. They find themselves in even worse shape. As we saw in the last SHAD assignment, the higher your earnings, the more likely you are to have a pension, or as well as health insurance and other benefits. Except for the very highest wage groups, the gender gap is closing. I looked at the numbers, I made a chart, and what you can see is if we look at women's wage as a share of men's wage at the 10th percentile, women have caught up. They don't trail men by that much. If you look at the median woman compared to what the median man is making in terms of wages, they have caught up by about 7 percentage points. And in this time, the difference used to be about 24%. Now it's only 16%. So just in this time period, about a third of the gap for those at the median has been eliminated. People at the 90th percentile, there was less of a difference, but they improved. But as I said before, the big jump was for men at the very top. And what we see if you look at those in the 95th percentile, if we compare women at the 95th percentile to men at the 95th percentile, that gap has increased. We're going to talk more about that in the next chapter when we look at discrimination. Now, I didn't give you the numbers. I thought there was more than enough numbers to give you, but this same data set was compiled by an organization called the Economic Policy Institute. What they found was black wages, the wages of blacks relative to whites, fell at every percentile. So if you look at blacks in the 10th percentile compared to whites at the 10th percentile, between 2000 and 2018, those in the 10th percentile, both blacks and whites, we found out the ratio of black to white fell. Same thing at the median, same thing at 90th, 80th, 95th. So blacks relative to whites have seen their position decrease over the last 18 years. Now, I didn't present the data once again, but Hispanics narrowed the gap with whites, except at the very top two groups. So what we see is blacks are falling farther behind relative to whites at every point in the income distribution. Hispanics are catching up except at the very top. Now, why have wages become more, I should have corrected it. Why have wages become more dispersed? This is presented well in the text, and yeah, you got to read the book. So I'm not going to go into it. Sounds like a great question to put on the exam. You'll see that in Chapter 15. We're going to be covering Chapter 12 next. Probably in a day or two, I'll make the video on that. So everybody, stay well, take care, and I hope the weather's as nice where you are as it is here right now.